After receiving PD from the district about how to do a close read, I returned to my classroom with some real hesitations and doubts. But I was intrigued by the process, so I decided to use an article that we received during the training about Martin Luther King Jr. I was confident that it was complex, and I passed it out and let them read it quietly through to themselves. We discussed the article briefly, and then the students read it through one more time, this time circling the words or phrases they didn't understand. As they were circling, I walked around the room and observed which words they were circling. Some of the words that they circled were unexpected. The word unfortunately was circled frequently, and this was a surprise to me. It was circled by both my ELLs and my grade level students. I didn't expect this. The words defending, face jail, and led marches were also circled by many of my students, but I was confident that I could address those words, whole group, fairly easily. I compared what my top students were circling with the words my lowest students were circling, and I began to see a pattern. I read the piece to them aloud, and this time asked them some text-dependent questions to further check for understanding. We talked about the words that they wrote down to see if we could figure out some of them by just using context clues, and this helped. I had them put their papers away for the day without addressing all of their questions. It was clear to me at the end of the first day exactly what concepts and big ideas, what language I was going to need to scaffold over the course of the next few days. Civil rights, segregated, Nobel Prize were common words that all of them encircled from my lowest students to my highest students. I would need to do some work with these words. I'd also have to address some of the ELL issues regarding other words that they circled during my ELD time. Finally, I knew I needed to get a parallel text that had pictures and some basic background information to help build understanding. I had a book in my library and decided to use that. As we started day 2, I read the book to them that I picked out yesterday. It was filled with the background information about who Martin Luther King was, as well as some brief references to some of the same big ideas as the article. I asked text-dependent questions in regarding to the book that we read, and it was clear there were still some gaps in their understanding, but they did have a better background understanding about who he was and what he did, when he lived, that kind of information. Students got out their articles again, and on the back we did a quick write about the book, and I observed as they were writing. They read their own articles one more time quietly to themselves. Then we discussed some of the words that they still needed help with. As expected, segregation and civil rights were mentioned by many. But I was prepared for them. The night before, I'd found pictures of segregation that I thought were appropriate for my class. It included pictures of water fountains that were labeled for whites and for blacks. A discussion about the word segregation and came up with a basic definition. We began to tackle the question of segregation because of color. We referred back to the text because the definition is in the text. We had to discuss the term color, and the second picture that I picked out helped with that. A classroom of black students and a classroom of white students. We spent time looking at the classroom and talking about the difference between the two. The last picture I showed them was of a civil rights march. We analyzed the photo, I read the signs to them, we looked at the people, the faces, their dress. I asked how the signs related to the previous picture of the classrooms, and we had a discussion about that. We had to dissect the term civil and rights, and we applied it to other situations, simple situations that they could understand. We finished the day by doing a read aloud of the article, and this time, if they understood something today that they didn't understand yesterday, I had them put a happy face near those words or that concept. I observed as they progressed, and after looking at many smiley faces, I was confident we were ready to move on. Starting with day 3, I had them reread the passage this time again, turn to their neighbor, and talk about what they understood. We'd had collaborative conversations previous to this, but this time it was a summary conversation. I noticed they were beginning to use the vocabulary in their discussions, and most of them were using the words correctly and in the correct context. Not only that, but students were engaged and excited about what they were learning. I asked the students if they wanted to see the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, which was referenced in the close read, and they were very excited about seeing that. I showed it to them and asked them questions about the speech and how it related to the passage. They had heard him say, quote, by the color of their skin, and several students talked about how they understood what he was saying. We shared about how they would dream that the world would be a better place. Finally, there were 3 comprehension questions that went with the article, and we went through each one of the questions together. I talked to them about the question. We looked for evidence in the text to be able to answer the question. I let them do some group talk before they had to write the answer on their own. I was only there to guide them when necessary. I did know that I would have to stand near a certain group of students during this time based on what I observed earlier. Often my ELLs would need help with spelling and exact phrasing to be able to answer these questions. At the end, the students had to write a sentence on their own using one of the vocabulary words. They got to choose which word, and they had to do that based on the work that they'd done so far. I collected those to review them later that day and knew that I had some individual work to do with certain students, but generally speaking, most of the students were really grasping the concepts. At the end of the week, we pulled out their articles and I displayed the pictures one more time, with students using some of the vocabulary in other parts of the day, making reference to some of the complex ideas we talked about. I was confident that they'd be able to answer the question at the end of the article, and we were going to use that as our writing assignment. I'd reviewed their vocabulary work from the day before, and it looked really pretty good. Armed with the evidence that they gathered, they answered the question, quote, "Can you think of ways the world is a better place now because of Martin Luther King Jr.'s hard work?" They wrote some of the best pieces that they'd written all year long. They had clear details and they supported their answers. I'm now a believer in the power of a close read.